life.
Alright, welcome to the Warwick Marxist event. Today we have a talk on Catalonia and what's going on there. We will be raising money for the Catalan struggle, so if you want to help people in Catalonia and the revolutionaries there, then please leave a donation at the end. The pamphlets that we handed out, they're £1 each if you're interested. Next week we'll be celebrating 100 years since the Russian Revolution, so we have an event every day. We're giving a talk on Monday. We've got a social. We've got a filming of We're Watching Animal Farm on Tuesday. We've got a debate, and Friday to Sunday we're going to London for the Revolution event. If any of you are interested, they're £10. Trotsky's grandson will be giving a talk, so it'll be very interesting. Yeah, so now Thomas will give a talk on the Catalan struggle.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Juba. And thank you for everyone who's come along tonight to actually discuss what I believe could be an incredibly important issue in modern politics, and really actually define not just Spanish, not just Catalan political life, but actually political life throughout Europe and ultimately the world. Spain, for anyone who's briefly aware of its history, has an immense amount of time and has immense amount of historical struggles on questions of socialism, on battling fascism, and actually the historical crisis going on. With the exception of the Russian Revolution, I would go on to argue that the Spanish Revolution from 1933 to 1939 was probably one of the strongest revolutionary events in European history in the 20th century. And so actually then what's currently going on in Catalonia then is not just important for the region as a whole, but also for actually the class struggle and throughout Europe. So yeah, what has happened? Well, in recent events, for anyone who's been keeping up with the news, we've seen. I just realised I'm looking at the wrong section of notes. 2 seconds. We've just seen, my economics degree. No, we've seen, the Catalan people hold a referendum with immense turnout in direct defiance of the Spanish state. Over 800 people were injured when police officers came in to try and stop people voting on their ability to hold a referendum to decide if they are an independent nation or not. We've seen referendum defence committees set up by local ordinary people throughout the Catalan period, not just in Barcelona, but through all the small towns and cities that are in the region. Actually working people taking control of what's going on in society there. We've seen mass general strikes in support of this, and a huge backlash by the Spanish state. Everything from dockers going on strike to stop police boarding at the docks, to school children and parents going in and holding schools down so people will be allowed to vote. And despite all of this, the referendum was a success. There were a huge proportion amount of people in favour, almost an absolute majority, despite the repression on top. And yet, the leadership, the PDCAT, or if anyone knows Spanish, I would know how all these parties are pronounced, etc., which would be quite helpful, has postponed and has actually betrayed and gone back over the struggle to actually declare independence. So why has this happened? What are the class dynamics before it? What can we learn? And how ultimately does this achieve socialism? So I feel to really examine this, we have to look actually, where does modern Spain, modern Catalan politics all originate from? And it originates in the 1978 regime, after the death of the Franco dictatorship and the collapse of fascism, well, not the collapse of fascism, and the transition from fascism to liberal democracy, which happened in the 70s. So again, people who know, the Spanish regime took part, so the current regime comes after 40 years where Spain was held under a brutal dictatorship. From, with hundreds of prison camps set up across Spain, hundreds of thousands killed in the Civil War, 50,000 executed in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, wages heavily repressed, unions banned unless they were ran by the state, and major forms of repression going on under the dictatorship of Franco. It is Actually, I had the opportunity to speak to one of my friends who was from Spain, and she gave a talk actually on the Spanish Civil War and the Franco-fascist dictatorship that followed. About how her, let's say, her grandfather was taken up and executed for fighting against, for fighting for the Reds on the in the Civil War. How actually almost all villages would have paths in Spain where you could walk that, where there would it would walk into the countryside. And if you walked, the police would come along, take people along it, walk them along, and they would never be seen again. It was an incredibly repressive dictatorship, rightly deserving the name fascist for its social base, and not talked about at all in what I would say most of Western history books I've come across, most analysis of fascism, and ultimately even in Spain itself, which refuses now to actually talk about the events of the Civil War and the dictatorship there. But yeah, so the Spanish Revolution was defeated, the dictatorship installed. The working class were heavily crushed, and this continued for about 40 years. But by the 70s, the regime was starting to come to an end. But most of any of you know or understand, let's say, the basic fascism works. It is designed as a political ideology around the crushing of the working class and any groups that support it. What we saw in Spain, again, fits this definition, ultimately needed a large petty bourgeois, peasantry base or middle class base to go around. In the 1930s, this was possible. As Spain became more industrialized and more proletarianized, this regime started to wear off. The ruling classes became more and more upset with, found it more and more difficult to rule with direct dictatorship. And by the beginning of the 1970s, a revolutionary movement was brewing through Spain. By 1976, strikes were commonplace, going even through the organised unions, which were supposed to be organised by the state. There were elements of dual power were emerging, the running of society by the workers in opposition to the capitalists. And the army was increasingly turning against the regime, mass demoralisation. Spain was becoming increasingly unstable. Moreover, Franco had died in 1975 and led his successor, King Juan Carlos I. He appointed him in 1969 to lead after his death. More than that, the huge class struggle erupting in Spain was creating an immense capital strike at this time of 8 billion, what did you say, pestas? My Spanish is really terrible, so just apologies throughout this entire talk as I murder every Spanish word I come across. But let's go for it. Let's say pestas a day. And ultimately, what happened, we were seeing a revolutionary wave emerging. If you speak to many people who were around at this time, and I've had the opportunity to do so, they talked about, in this, it was an actual pre-revolutionary situation that emerged. What happened? Why are we not talking about, how Spain started the socialist revolution, liberated all of Europe, the world from capitalism, and, we now live in a communist utopian society? Well, ultimately, what occurred was the working class leaders of the PSOE, the Spanish Socialist Party, and the PCE, the Spanish Communist Party, ultimately betrayed the working class to stop the revolution and siding with it. They developed very much reformist tendencies. They'd given up on the ideas of socialism, of revolution, and so when these events did appear, despite these are the ideas that people were exactly looking for, how to overthrow the regime, they had nothing to offer. And ultimately, again, betrayed the mass movement. They signed what was in fact known as the Monaca Agreement, where actually you saw in the trade for being legal parties, for the Spanish Socialist Party becoming legal, for the Spanish Communist Party becoming legalized, they accepted huge attacks where wages would be stuck far, far below the inflation rate, i.e. Huge cut in wages, the sacking of 5% of the workforce with no problems asked, the freezing of public funds, the completing rule out of national self-determination, and for all the elements of the Spanish ruling class, the Franco-fascist dictatorship ruling class, to remain in place. So much so, but they didn't even change the leader of the country during this period to apparent democracy. It still remained King Carlos, who was himself appointed by Franco. And what you get again, you even see his son, so we'll come back to this as we eventually catch up with the history. The other day actually came out against a democratic decision for Catalan people to control their own lives. Which again, incredibly ironic considering for a appointed monarch, a monarch appointed by a fascist dictator. The army remained completely intact, it was never removed of its fascist elements. And effectively what is considered the Tory party in Spain, the PP, was actually founded by 7 of the ministers. So rather than being this mass revolutionary event, because of the portrayal of the working class leaders in the Spanish Socialist Party, in the Spanish Communist Party, what you then saw was in fact actually a continuation of the regime now with just this democratic facade on. Huge demoralisation among the left. And this incredible control, and it is, lessons, again, we can learn a lot from these, and it is worth a whole discussion of its own, the betrayal that went over here. Ultimately, again, this is just to give you a kind of background, to kind of understand when the Spanish state takes out such horrific actions, as again, beating 800 people, including elderly, children, etc. When, it feels prepared to completely annihilate the chance of any self-determination with any one of its regions, including from Catalan to the Basque country to Galicia. Again, sorry for the butchering of the Spanish. These are the roots of a regime. It is rooted in the a trade between between reformist leaders of the working class to maintain capitalism and maintain that setup. So there you go. But anyway, so that's kind of a bit of background. Really, really rushed over. Which then kind of brings us actually to the modern state. The instability of Spain. What did Spain then go on to be this wonderful liberal bourgeois wonderland, where the free market reigned and everyone was happy? Unfortunately not. Unfortunately, capitalism has its own contradictions. And in 2008, we saw these contradictions hit with a bang. Spain had grown rich on 14 years of boom between 1994 and 2008. This was developed on huge loans from European banks, paying massive amounts of investment, etc., with huge interest rates and all the like. And ultimately, again, I assume this doesn't really shock horror to anyone, there was a big economic crisis in 2008, hitting Europe in 2010. European banks failed, and suddenly all these European banks who lend lavishly to Spain and Greece as well say, please pay our debts back. Please pay us back. And what will the Spanish people go, we can't. We don't have the money there. There isn't that amount of growth. Capitalism has extended itself. It's created all these loans, but ultimately there is no real value in the economy backing behind it. So they say, well, you're going to have to find some. And they're like, where? And they're like, well, just attack your working class. Just, commit huge amounts of austerity and, see youth unemployment reach over 40%. And the Spanish government is like, good plan. And commits horrific amounts of austerity, led by, again, the PP in Spain. Again, just read Spanish Torrents if you're not too familiar. They attack health, they attack education, they attack labour rights, they attack democratic freedom, they massively attack all of this going on. And ultimately, what does it do? Well, in 2008, debt to GDP is about 70% of the economy. By 2010, it's reached 100%. There is no solution. And ultimately, this is, we can come back to, I imagine, many times throughout the year. Ultimately, capitalism cannot find a solution to its crisis. It can move them about, can try and change, alter what they are. But ultimately, the economic contradictions of capitalism always return with a bang, and especially in our current crisis, which is definitely unique about this, is it proving incredibly difficult to find a way out. We got this. So anyway, what do we see happens? Well, do all the other left-wing parties, the Socialist Party, the PSOE, get behind and say, no, we're going to fight austerity, we're going to defend working class interests? Unfortunately not. They instead link up with the PP, continue to carry out austerity tax, and even a group called the United Left, come out and continue these attacks. Again, I'd be surprised if it's an unfamiliar story. Anyone who's lived in any European state and also the US and Western democracies in particular, but again also similar things we found right across the world, is probably very much aware the capitalist class come down and ask for retributions, and many of the centrists and the liberals and the reformists happily stand by. But in 2011, 2014, we see the Indignados movement really start to take off in Spain. This is a huge movement which millions of people come out onto the streets, they protest against austerity, they argue for a new system. Effectively, again, it was very similar to the Occupy movements we saw back in 2010, 2011, for those who can remember. Millions of people coming out onto the streets saying, no, enough is enough, we need a change. The problem with these movements is it didn't have any political expression. It said, all of the above are rubbish, but didn't offer an alternative and didn't fight on a political field. Well, from this, again, the Spaniards were quick to learn. And Podemos quickly took off from it. From 2014 to 2015, it quickly became the most popular party in all of Spain, getting about 25-26% in the polls compared to the PP, which was around 24-23. However, despite and there was a huge amount of talk again around this time of when is Podemos finally going to actually conquer Spain? When is it going to actually become the Spanish government? Unfortunately, it began to stall. You had a huge watering down of the campaign, effectively as Podemos went, well, the Socialist Party's collapsing now, so we should take their policies to grab their voters, was pretty much how the logic went. Again, very similar patterns emerged from the Labour right wing, who basically say, we should continue to go for these centre policies, grab the centre ground, etc. And in trying to jump for the centre ground, find themselves jumping off the cliff on a basis which, a base in society which isn't there. The organisation, which grew very quickly from a grassroots basis to try and cement itself, became bureaucratic and incredibly top-down. Ruling class pursued political hysteria with really quite unprecedented levels, claiming that if Podemos was to arrive, it would make Spain the entry point of Europe for Venezuelan cocaine. And Spain would become this huge port where these damn socialists in Venezuela would be sending all their cocaine all across Europe. It'd be the collapse of Western civilization. And again, this had to effect. They also then began promoting their own kind of, radical centre party of, I'll be honest, I've been researching this for a long time and I still don't know how to pronounce that.
Pronounce what?
Ciudadanos. Thank you very much.
Ciudadanos. Citizens in English.
Yeah, I just don't know about it. Ciudadanos. There we go. And also, and this will definitely come a bit more, a pole position towards the nationalities. In fact, actually, one of the most outrageous things about the recent events has been Podemos's impossibility of actually, taking a correct position towards the Catalan people, arguing instead there should be a legal referendum. But, and again, will become more clear, a legal referendum just isn't possible. The Spanish state refused to give a legal referendum. There was no way you can have a referendum under current conditions for it to be real. And this, again, lost them losing out in Catalonia, in the Basque country, and in Galicia. And ultimately, as well, a real thing to keep in mind is also the example of Syriza. Again, Syriza was the Greek left-wing government which came to power on a massive anti-austerity program in early 2015. They came to power saying, it's all going to be great, and ultimately betrayed the working class in a horrific stance where they went completely back on the referendum and actually ended up implementing far greater austerity than need to be, humiliating the Greek country, and ultimately agreeing with the liquidation of Greece as a country. EU bureaucrats and EU technocrats then go over from Greece, go to Podemos rallies and effectively say, if you vote for them, this is what will happen. In fact, there are some arguments that even Greece was treated so harshly by the European Union in order to make an example out of similar movements developing in Spain, and again, at this time also the Corbyn movement beginning to develop. So Podemos began to stolen the polls. But they were still doing quite well. They were still around the 20% mark. And ultimately, unfortunately, they weren't for the Spanish bourgeoisie. They were still in a democracy. And the elections of December 2015 became completely gridlocked in the Spanish state. There was no movement. Four parties, the PP, the PSOE, Ciudadanos, and Podemos, all getting around the 20% mark. A huge fall for the PP, from 44% to 25%, but still the biggest party by just about. The Podemos go to the Socialist Party of Spain and they're like, guys, we should make a left-wing alliance. Socialist Party for Spain go, oh sugar, they've got us here. We've kind of just been like ignoring that for a bit, and this like whole socialism thing, and this whole like left-wing stuff. What should we do? And they're basically like, we should just ignore it. And they're like, well, how can we ignore it? We've got a form of government, just ignore it. And so they failed to, no negotiation happened. And ultimately new elections are called. But still, and this is, again, the real tragedy in the Spanish ruling class, Podemos still, again, rather than radicalising their programme, they water it down even further on the basis we can take all of the PSOE vote, we can take all of the Socialist Party vote if we just bring a few more of their policies on. And ultimately it leads to them gaining less votes. By continuing to water down their policy to attract what in their eyes is the masses, they ultimately alienate the vast majority of working class people and the vast majority of people in looking as more of the same. So basically, the new election happens, pretty much the exact same thing. Now the Socialist Party is like, okay guys, what do we do now? There should be a government, because generally that's how like capitalist democracies work. You need someone in charge. They're like, well, we agree on that. But we don't really want Podemos to have it. It couldn't really work out at the moment if it tried. So maybe we should just go right ahead and support the Spanish Tories. And half of the party's like, what? That would be ridiculous. And the other half party's like, too loud, we've already launched a coup, removed all your democratic rights for the party. And yeah, the PSOE now completely supports the ruling Tory party, the PP in Spain. And and they're able to form a government with the backing of PSOE and Ciudadanos. Now, whilst all this is going on, you've then also got the same instability happening throughout Catalonia, which is, of course, why we're here to discuss it. And with a failure for the left to show a solution, and support for independence begins to rise. In about 2010, that's wrong. In about 2010, it was about 15%. By about 2015, support had risen to about 45%. Many groups of people were looking for a way out of austerity, and with Spanish governments completely failing them, Catalonia had elected Podemos first many times over, but still it was having no effect in how. You kind of saw, very similar SNP type effect. Here's an alternative, we break with the rest of Spain, and we try and, let's say, develop this thing. Now it's worth pointing out that right through this, again, a lot of the layers who were very much for independence, kind of for independence for its own sake, were kind of rural layers. Many of the peasantry heavily in favour of independence. Whilst there was a large deindustrialised working class area, kind of the rust belts around Catalonia, which were again very against independence. On the one hand, they, and the main reason being that many of them had immigrated to Catalan in the 60s and 70s looking for work, and ultimately didn't particularly see themselves as Catalonian. And this is, so this kind of, again, this starts to continue through there. And this is why, again, it's always been around 45%, at least for the last 2 years, on the basis that there were large or considerable sections of the working class, I should say, who were not won over to the idea of an independence campaign. But the ruling party of Spain was the CDC. And they effectively continually, again, used independence to stir up support. Use independence as an excuse when things didn't go well and when it got worse for working people, and as a way to kind of as a way to kind of draw on their own support, this kind of peasantry layer and also a middle class layer going on. So they initially come to power in 2011, using independence to lose reliance on the PP. The PP sees, and I should have gone over this a bit more detail, but again, one of the foundation blocks of the Spanish regime of 1978 was the indissolubility of Spain. The PP was always against this, and to try and lose this support and try and actually break with them to again become increasingly unpopular, the CDC pushes up the issue of independence. Ultimately, again, and the CDC, we should really highlight, is a bourgeois party. They're completely in the throes of the ruling class, made up often with their sections of bankers, etc., and stuff like that. And use independence not as actually a way of promoting any general type of freedom or anything like that, but in incredibly cynical moves to use the threat of independence to gain concessions from the Spanish government. In fact, this is, and also to maintain their own support. This was the case all the way throughout. They call the independence. When the Spanish government won't work with them, they call up on the threat of independence. They say, "Well, we will do this. We will show how horrific you are, and also, unleash this mass movement, etc. Unless you give us these concessions, allow more business to be put in Catalonia and stuff like this." But one of the other things worth really highlighting as well is also the very right-wing nature. In fact, actually, the CDC were far more right-wing in their implementation of austerity, in their cuts to the system and their attacks on the working class than the PP ever were. So again, they've got this cynical use of independence. In 2013, they call a referendum, which is then on, should Catalonia be, its independent state, and it's immediately knocked down by the courts as unconstitutional. And again, it creates a bit of conflict here. In November 2014, a similar thing. The government's looking a bit weak. So in November 2014, they hold an illegal referendum, actually defined as a consultation. And 2.3 million people go out to vote. And again, main support from rural areas. And then they just say, well, okay, a lot of people have voted, but don't do too much with it. So they then, the next election's coming up, it's not looking too great, and they call a plebiscite. They say the next election, this will be a plebiscite on independence. If you vote for all us independence parties, you are voting for independence. It isn't about which particular party rules. It is either independence or not in the Catalan elections. And this is when things start heating up along the independence line. So firstly, what we see is actually, again, an incredibly cynical ploy, because it pulls another kind of left-wing Catalan nationalist party into the links of CDC, allowing them to kind of ignore the, kind of give them a bit of shelter from the horrific attacks they're doing. But then they also start to really get a bit of backlash now from the international ruling class. There's massive financial threats against the bank, from banks, from companies, etc., to those defending independence. And Rajoy, the Spanish Prime Minister, Angela Merkel, Barack Obama, John Paul Juncker, head of the EU, and the Catholic Church all come in and give their things about how this is terrible, how the CDC are awful, how independence will be a horrific idea, and we should all really stop talking about it. The election in the end, with all of this going on, and again the right-wing nature of it, just falls short of the majority, with actually the CDC losing candidates, but another party, the CUP, usually, just to give you a heads up, the Marxist societies are just running over acronyms of political parties. There's usually a lot less of that. It's usually just different political thinkers, actually. So yeah, the election falls short of the majority, but the CUP, a very, very radical left-wing party, gains massively, tripling its share in the votes, from 3 to 10 MPs. So yeah, So 27. So now this kind of brings us up to Monday. So what actually is going on? What is the situation in Spain before this referendum gets called? There is a huge economic crisis. The working class is suffering terribly. Again, it's linked in with the pigs. Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain, all of the very weak links. The PP is deeply unpopular and incredibly unstable government. Remember, they get to government on the fact that the Socialist Party refuses to vote against them, causing itself a massive split. Again, having a coalition with Ciudadanos and still being a minority government even then, incredibly unstable. Demas is continuing to moderate their programme, and the PP effectively despise independence greater and greater. A couple of key reasons for this. Again, as I mentioned before, the crushing of individual nationalities was an integral part to securing the regime. Stirring up Spanish nationalism is again used cynically to effectively try and boost their popularity. And also they also fear a victory. Ultimately, the PP know that if a referendum is called, many, even if it was given full legality, even if they could do effectively a David Cameron, we did with Scotland, and say, okay, we'll have the debate, etc., that many, because of how enshrined it is in the constitution of Spain, would simply, who oppose independence, would simply not vote out of principle. Meaning that whatever happened with the referendum, if it was given full legality, would see Catalan seceding. So they cannot come on that. Meanwhile, so we have the PP, who's deeply unpopular, trying to maintain control by stirring up Spanish nationalism. On the other hand, we have the CDC, deeply hated, putting in austerity, and leaning on independence of left-wing nationalist parties, very left-wing nationalist parties that bring them. That's 2017 approaches. Again, to give you an idea, it'd be a bit like, so the CDC, ERC, and the CUP would be a bit like if Tories, Labour, and the Communist Party of Great Britain all kind of got together to try and form a government. Like, this is about, it's not completely accurate. This gives you a kind of idea of the instability and the ideological spread on these. And ultimately, by the beginning of mid-2017, this alliance is falling apart. It's proving completely ungovernable. So they're like, shit, what are we going to do? They're like, yeah, what are we going to do? And, okay, so, things falling apart. And they say, okay, we're going to call an independence referendum. A bit like, well, we've kind of seen this before. With the government collapsing, there we go, thank you very much, Kevin.
Sorry, I had another event, sorry.
No worries. So with the government collapsing, the CDC attempts another referendum to try and back up and boost their support. The idea kind of being, okay, what will happen? We'll really push an independence referendum. The Spanish state will come down, crush it all out. We'll have no attempt. We'll just have to put our hands up and go, look at the awful Spanish government. We cannot exercise our right for independence. Oh well, just continue to vote for us. Again, really quite cynical move. Ultimately, again, they have used and continually use the idea of independence in a very cynical way. But anyway, so they say a referendum to try and maintain the government. Catalan National Day, 11th of September, sees a mass protest coming out, with Podemos failing to really offer a solution. More and more people, huge numbers of the working class, especially the industrial working class in the cities, are coming out in support of the referendum as a way to change the system, as a way to stick it down to Rajoy. And suddenly, the class content of this begins to change. Rather than having, again, more peasant layers just being kind of involved in middle class areas, you see a big opening onto the scene of vast amount of the working class coming in. And then this really does bring us up into the last few weeks. Spain comes down with huge levels of repression. It threatens to arrest all 750 mayors of Catalonia. It shuts down websites, fines and prosecutes people, bans official publicity, uses the police, etc. And all this does is then stir up even more resentment against this hated government, against this mass repression, against effectively basic democratic rights being put down. We really now start to see a mass movement emerging against this. Students and staff walk out of schools and universities. There's call for a mass general strike, referendum defence committees throwing up, mass rallies all over Catalonia. The police are stopped by mass mobilisation. High school students, teachers, again, holding polling stations down, and really people entering on the huge stage. Well, now the problem is, and this is where it really gets difficult, whilst the initial plan of the CDC was very much like something like, oh, okay, well, we tried our best, they are now being pushed forward with the whole might of the Catalonian working class to put it back in. If they were to pull out at this point, they would risk losing their entire electability and losing all support and effectively disappearing as a party. They find themselves having to keep going forward to keep up with this referendum. And 5,000 independents join in. So a referendum happens, October the 1st, over 800 are injured by the police. The police actively use rubber bullets, themselves banned by the Catalan government. You have fascist demonstrators roaming the streets freely. And overall, 2.26 million people vote, with 2.2 million VS. This, of course, doesn't even begin to include the 770,000 people who were unable to vote due to their polling stations being destroyed, their ballots being destroyed by the police, those who weren't able to vote due to intimidation, due to roads being closed off, etc., etc., etc. A huge, huge mass movement. So now after the result, key unions now get involved, preparing the ground for a mass strike. Millions march. Towns like, again, this is in the last few days. Towns like Girona.
Spelled it wrong.
Girona. I mean, I did a
No, God, you
PowerPoint.
can check the spelling, Thomas.
I put my hands up. I do a PowerPoint. It's more than Adam did last week. Towns like Girona saw 50% of their population march. A population of 100,000. 50,000 people come to march for your independence. This is a huge movement. But also at this point, one thing should also be stressed, actually, the reluctance of the Spanish unions to get involved. Whilst the smaller unions were all out calling for a mass general strike weeks before the election came out, the UGs, the leading unions, the UGT and the CCOO, failed to actually wouldn't even call the general strike a strike. They instead said, oh, it's a stoppage, we're going to work with the bosses, they're still going to pay people, etc. And then we'll just all close it down, it'll all be like civil society. Again, this is a horrific act and really should be called out of effectively class collaboration, believing that the bosses are ultimately on the side of the working class and the mass movements. It is obvious that the bourgeois have no interest whatsoever in seeing Catalonia collapse and fall down, seeing Catalonia succeed. As again, we'll see in the next slide, huge amounts of huge amounts of the banks and big businesses are pulling out. To believe that we can simply work with the bosses to do this, ultimately will lead working people and working down the blind alley. So yeah. So whilst all of this happening, whilst having this mass mobilisation, at the same time we've got reaction. The bourgeois, the Spanish, Catalonian and international bourgeois are now mobilising against this referendum in an immense way. The king publicly comes out and denounces Catalans, denounces their rights for independence, and says that this cannot happen. Again, it will be the king was supposed to have an apolitical atmosphere. Not only in the same idea as like Queen Elizabeth II, etc., still coming directly on these political issues, because it threatens the very regime in which he was built up on. And just again, like I feel it really is worth going over. The king whose name escapes me.
Which king?
Philip. Wait, what was his name?
Felipe.
Felipe.
Sixth, I think.
Felipe VI. Yeah, and again, his father was appointed by a fascist dictator to go on and then goes and lectures people about democracy, which, I mean, it truly is beyond parody. The leader of the PP remarked that if Catalan went down the same route in trying to strive for independence and trying to strive for use mass working class movements, he said, well, if it will go down the same route as the 1930s, it will end the same way. Again, how it ended in the 1930s was a slaughtering, was hundreds of thousands dead. The leader of the government comes out and says, well, that's just how it's going to have to be. And Catalonian capitalists, bosses' unions are now actively organising. Companies and banks are trying to saying it and have already done so to move all their finances and issues out as immediately as possible. And also at the same time, you are seeing. Okay, so I'll finish up very quickly. Huge counter-protests of over 300,000 people trying to protest against the referendum. Now, it is worth analysing the counter-protests, and I will go into this a bit more detail. Ultimately, a lot of these are middle and upper class people. Again, and also, your alt-right, Nazis, etc., stuff like that. Quite cool. Also, again, large sections of the working class, or considerable sections of the working class, are part of this. People who actually, again, don't particularly want to break Catalan, and more importantly, do see the class nature of actually who is behind the referendum, the CDC, who actually, is ultimately, bourgeois, and has done many austerity camps. So anyway, this then brings us to it, and kind of what I've been hinting at, and again, people have been watching how this is going. 2 days ago, the CDU finally betrays. October the 10th was supposed to be the day, Tuesday was supposed to be the day in which the government was come out of Carles. I'm just not going to try. Was supposed to come out and say, this is a unilateral declaration of independence. We're seceding from Spain. We are no longer part of Spain. And this was the speech he was expected to give. It's all prepping up. He gets there. And he's just about to enter stage, and suddenly a minute before, an announcer comes on and say there's been an hour delay. Okay, people are a bit like, well, fair enough. Maybe he ate something bad in the loo, I don't know. It's on the loo. Who knows? Maybe, he had an appointment, dentist appointment he forgot. Perhaps that could be going on. Unfortunately not. What he comes on and says, the mandate that Catalonia shall become an independent state in the form of we have the mandate that Catalonia shall become an independent state in the form of a republic. Everyone's cheering, it's been an immense time of struggle and come forward. And then we pose that Parliament suspends the effects of Declaration of Independence. So in the next few weeks, we embark upon dialogue, i.e., we are not going to declare independence. We're going to try and negotiate with the Spain to try and work something out. And this is not ultimately where we're going to go on. But people are shocked. I mean, again, the idea of negotiating with the Spanish government, which has been beating up old women to stop this from happening, which is using all forces at its disposal from Europe, from the EU, from banks, big businesses, etc. And the belief that you can just negotiate it with this is ultimately a 100% a form of betrayal. It cannot happen. It's either... if you want to give, the CDU credit, you can say, they're just very utopian and optimistic, perhaps in the same way Yanis Varoufakis Syriza was, where they believed, we can just negotiate with big banks and businesses and they'll let Greece off the hook. Or is more likely this, that you have their class interests have come to the fore. They're not prepared to threaten the capitalist interests in Catalonia. And ultimately, for that reason, are trying to back down and trying to find a way out. So again, that was 2 days ago. And these talks are starting. So the question is, where is Catalonia going? And what we see is that the CDU cannot create independence without losing all its bourgeois, cannot completely break with independence without losing all support. Nor can they have a direct clash between Spain and the EU, and they're caught in this, effectively, they're between a rock and a hard place, they cannot move. Whilst the Spanish government is increasingly ramping up calls to rule by direct decree and end all autonomy. So ultimately, where is it going? What is required to make the Catalan revolutionary success, or the Catalan independence success, is ultimately independence is a revolutionary task in the context of Spain, in the context of Catalonia. The bourgeois and the Spanish state will not let Catalonia go free. They will not let have its independence for reasons explained. Only the working class, the organised working class, can come through and make this democratic decision. They must organise on the referendum defence committees, local working people's organisations, create these as an organised all across Catalonia, actually give the working class political voice. Furthermore, you cannot, technically, if you want to actually win over the vast majority of workers, if you actually want to win over the people who are fighting on the streets for this, it has to be linked with anti-austerity. And that has to be on the basis of socialism. Because ultimately, and as we've seen, with the strike of capital, which is currently undertaken, which the effect of the bosses system and the attack on the bosses going in, the only way to avoid this is by socialisation, nationalisation of the banks and the largest companies under democratic workers' control. You cannot let these banks go here because they want to undermine the government. They do have no interest in letting Catalonia go alone. And unless they are stopped and actually taken control of by the people, they will simply take all the money out, sabotage the economy, and lead to direct collapse. Therefore, what are we saying? We're saying, put the banks, the biggest businesses, the factories, the bosses system under control of the democratic working class. Well, that is a socialist republic of Catalonia. That is the creation of socialism in Catalonia, and that is the only way in which succession can go on. If not, there will just be huge backlash and reaction for the Catalonian people. Furthermore, it does not end there. If we try to establish socialism in a small part of the Iberian Peninsula, you're not going to have too much luck. But this can act as a spark to the Iberian Revolution, as a letting this go all across Spain, all across Portugal, and all across Europe, and ultimately all across the world. Now that is the only way you're going to succeed in this. We'll get to see actually how this plays out. This is where class struggle comes into it. This is where the work of working people, working class people, actually starts to push for a socialist revolution. And the decisions will be made. Will the reactionary Spanish state, will they be able to win? Will the CUP be able to radicalise people? Will they have the correct platform and perspectives and reactions to wars, a whole lot of things? This is where class struggle, the role of organisations, the role of personalities, the role of key individuals can play an immense task. But ultimately, the goal is clear, that for Spain at the moment, it is either huge, or for Catalonia at the moment, is either huge reaction or socialism. There is no other two ways about it at this point. So yeah, on that basis, again, as Shuven explained at the beginning, we're asking for, we've got groups in Catalan as part of the International Marxist Tendency, asking for a few donations along there, if anyone has help out the fight. But yeah, I feel I've massively overrun. So I'll stop talking.
So we're going to go into a floor discussion now. So if anyone has any questions or comments.